My name's Abigail, and I've always been a go-getter. For years, I poured my heart and soul into my career at a construction company. I started as a lowly intern, but through sheer determination and countless late nights, I clawed my way up to deputy director. I was overseeing the most challenging architectural marvels in the city. Skyscrapers that kissed the clouds, bridges that spanned impossible distances, and buildings that defied gravity. Each one was a testament to what I could achieve when I set my mind to it. My colleagues used to joke that I was married to my job. They weren't far off. I lived and breathed construction. My apartment was filled with blueprints and models. My weekends were spent touring building sites. And my bank account? Well, let's just say it was very healthy. But as I approached my mid-30s, something changed. I'd look at the towering structures I'd helped create and feel a sense of pride, sure. But there was also an emptiness, a void that no amount of professional success could fill. It was like a switch had been flipped. Suddenly I saw couples everywhere, holding hands in the park, pushing strollers down the street, stealing kisses in cafes. And I wanted that. I wanted it badly. But dating at 36 isn't easy, especially when you've spent the last decade focused solely on your career. I tried the apps, went on a few awkward blind dates set up by well-meaning friends. Nothing clicked. Then, at an industry conference of all places, I met Tom. He was charming, intelligent, and shared my passion for architecture. We bonded over our mutual love of Frank Lloyd Wright and our shared frustration with city zoning laws. Our relationship moved quickly. Within a year, we were married in a small ceremony surrounded by our closest friends and family. I'd never been happier. One night, as we cuddled on the couch in our cozy apartment, Tom turned to me with a glint in his eye. "Abby," he said, using the nickname only he was allowed to use, "I've been thinking, why don't we build our own house? Our dream house?" I threw my arms around him, nearly knocking him off the couch. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. I threw myself into designing our dream house with the same passion I'd always applied to my work projects. I enlisted the help of our company's leading architect, and together we created something truly special. We pored over every detail, from the layout to the materials. I wanted everything to be perfect. This wasn't just a house, it was our future. To fund our dream, we made the decision to sell our apartment. It was a big step, but we were both so excited about the prospect of our new home that we didn't hesitate. As construction began, I found myself spending more and more time at the site. I'd stand there, watching our plans come to life, brick by brick. It was exhilarating. "You know," Tom said one day, as we stood arm in arm, watching the framework of our house take shape, "there's still one thing missing from this picture." I looked at him, puzzled. "What's that?" He placed a hand gently on my stomach. "A little one to fill all these rooms." My heart skipped a beat. We'd talked about having children before, of course, but always in a vague, someday kind of way. But now, with our dream house becoming a reality, the idea suddenly felt very real and very right. The next 2 years were the happiest of my life. Our house was completed, and it was everything we dreamed of and more. Every room was filled with love and the promise of the family we were going to create. And then finally it happened. I still remember the moment I saw those 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold it. "Tom," I called out, my voice trembling with excitement. "Tom, come here." He rushed into the bathroom, concern etched on his face. "What is it? Are you okay?" I couldn't speak. I just held out the test. Tom let out a whoop of joy and swept me up in his arms, spinning me around the bathroom. We were both laughing and crying, overwhelmed with happiness. The next few months were a blur of doctor's appointments, nursery planning, and daydreams about our future. We decided not to find out the baby's sex, wanting it to be a surprise. At my 5-month checkup, the doctor confirmed that everything was progressing perfectly. Our baby was healthy and growing right on schedule. Tom and I left the clinic on cloud 9, already making plans for the next 4 months. The phone call came at 3:17 a.m. I remember because I glanced at the clock as I fumbled for my phone, my heart already racing with a sense of foreboding. "Mrs. Thompson," an unfamiliar voice. "I'm afraid there's been an accident." The next few hours passed in a blur. The hospital, the doctor's grim faces, the words that shattered my world. I'm sorry, we did everything we could. Tom was gone, just like that. A drunk driver, they said. He never stood a chance. I don't remember much of the following days. I moved through the funeral like a ghost, barely registering the sympathetic touches, the murmured condolences. Weeks passed. I couldn't bring myself to go back to work. The thought of facing those towering buildings, those grand projects that Tom and I had once marveled at together, was unbearable. My boss, Jim, came to see me at home. He sat across from me, his face etched with concern. "Abigail," he said gently, "I think it might be best if you took some time off. Permanently, if that's what you need. We're prepared to offer you a substantial severance package. You won't have to worry about money." I should have felt grateful, but I felt nothing. Just a vast, empty numbness. As the weeks turned into months, I focused all my energy on my unborn child. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my son was born. As I held him in my arms for the first time, I felt a spark of something I thought I'd lost forever: hope. I named him Thomas, after his father. As I gazed into his tiny face, I saw echoes of Tom: the same nose, the same chin. It was both heartbreaking and healing. As Thomas grew, so did my love for him. He was a bright, curious child, always asking questions, always wanting to learn more. He excelled in school, bringing home report cards that made my heart swell with pride. As much as I loved watching Thomas thrive, I knew I needed something for myself too. So when he started school, I took a job at a small local construction firm. The salary was nothing compared to what I used to make, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that I could be home when Thomas got back from school, that I could attend his soccer games and help with his homework. We lived simply, but we were happy. Our house, once a symbol of the life Tom and I had dreamed of, became a home filled with laughter and love. And while the pain of losing Tom never fully went away, the joy of raising our son helped ease the ache. The years flew by, and before I knew it, Thomas was graduating high school. I stood in the audience, tears of pride in my eyes as I watched him accept his diploma. My little boy was all grown up. I got in. Mom, Thomas burst through the door one day, waving an acceptance letter. "I'm going to State University." My heart swelled with pride, even as it ached at the thought of him leaving. "That's wonderful, honey. I'm so proud of you." The day I dropped him off at college was one of the hardest of my life. As I helped him unpack in his dorm room, I couldn't help but think of my husband, wishing he could see the amazing young man our son had become. The house felt emptier than ever without Thomas, but I threw myself back into work, taking on more responsibilities at the construction firm. My experience and skills hadn't faded, and soon I was managing major projects again. I used my increased earnings to pay for Thomas's tuition and send him a monthly allowance. It was tight sometimes, but seeing him thrive made it all worthwhile. After graduation, Thomas decided to stay in the city where he'd gone to college. He landed a good job at a tech startup, and I couldn't have been prouder. I'd visit him most weekends, and we'd explore the city together. "Mom, you've got to try this new sushi place," he'd say. Or, "There's an art exhibit I think you'll love." Those weekends were precious to me, a chance to reconnect with my son and see the man he was becoming. Then, about 3 years after he graduated, Thomas called me, his voice brimming with excitement. "Mom, I've met someone. Her name's Jessica, and she's amazing." I was thrilled for him, of course. But as the weeks went by, I started to notice changes. Thomas began asking for more money, talking about expensive restaurants and designer clothes. "Mom," I was thinking, "maybe you could help me buy a car," he asked during one of our calls. "Jessica's family all drive really nice cars, and—" That's when alarm bells started ringing. "Thomas," I said firmly, "I love you, and I want you to be happy. But money can't buy love. If Jessica cares about you, it won't be because of expensive gifts or flashy cars." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Thomas spoke again, his voice was cold. "You just don't understand, Mom. Things are different here." After that, our calls became less frequent, our weekend visits rarer. It hurt, but I told myself it was just a phase. A year later, Thomas showed up at my door with a beautiful young woman. "Mom, this is Jessica. We're getting married." Jessica was indeed stunning, with perfectly styled hair and designer clothes. She was polite, and to my surprise, she seemed genuinely impressed by our home. "Oh my goodness," she exclaimed, her eyes wide as she took in the living room. "This house is incredible. I've never seen anything like it." She moved from room to room, marveling at the details. "The layout is so thoughtful, and the way you've maximized the natural light. It's just beautiful. And so functional, too." Thomas beamed, clearly pleased by her reaction. "We wanted to invite you to the wedding in person," he said, handing me an ornate invitation. "Jessica's parents are handling everything." As they left, I felt a mix of emotions. Jessica's admiration for the house seemed genuine, but I still couldn't shake a feeling of unease about the changes I'd seen in Thomas. The wedding was a lavish affair, more like a society event than a celebration of love. I felt out of place among the designer gowns and expensive jewelry, acutely aware of my own simple dress. As my bank account grew, so did an idea that had been percolating in the back of my mind. I wanted to do something special for Thomas and Jessica, to show them how much they meant to me. I started sketching plans for a house, one that would combine my years of experience with everything I knew about Thomas's tastes. But I held off on starting the project, telling myself to wait for the right moment. As it turned out, I didn't have to wait long. One sunny Saturday afternoon, the doorbell rang. To my surprise, Thomas and Jessica were standing on my porch, looking slightly nervous. "Mom," Thomas said, "we've been thinking. You're all alone in this big house, and well, we've decided to move back to the city. We thought maybe we could live here with you." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity as I helped Thomas and Jessica settle in. At first, everything seemed perfect. We had family dinners every night, and I loved hearing about their days over morning coffee. But as the weeks wore on, things began to change. It started small, Jessica rearranging the furniture without asking, or complaining about the brands of food I bought. Then one evening, as I was preparing dinner, Jessica swept into the kitchen, her nose wrinkling. "Abigail, darling," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "don't you think it's time we upgraded our menu a bit? Perhaps some foie gras, or at least a nice vintage wine. After all, this is our home now." "Actually," I said gently, "this is still my house. I'm happy to have you both here, but—" I didn't get to finish. Jessica's face contorted with rage. "Thomas," she shrieked. "Thomas, come here. Your mother is being impossible." Thomas came running, and to my shock, he immediately took Jessica's side. "Mom, what's your problem?" he yelled. "Can't you just do this one thing for us?" From that moment on, the atmosphere in the house became unbearably tense. Thomas and Jessica barely spoke to me, whispering to each other and falling silent whenever I entered a room. Then, one evening, I overheard a conversation that chilled me to the bone. I was about to enter the living room when I heard Jessica's voice, low and insistent. "We need to get her out, Thomas. This house is wasted on her. Think of what we could do with it." I froze, unable to believe what I was hearing. But Thomas's response was even worse. He actually laughed and said, "You're right, Mom's had her time. Maybe we should start looking into nursing homes. I hear the state ones aren't too bad." I couldn't contain myself any longer. I stepped into the room, shaking with anger and hurt. "Is that really what you think of me, Thomas? After everything we've been through?" Thomas looked startled, then guilty, but as he glanced at Jessica, his expression hardened. "Mom, I think it's time you left. This is our house now." I felt as if I'd been slapped. But in that moment, a lifetime of strength and determination surged through me. I drew myself up to my full height and looked my son straight in the eye. "No, Thomas," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "This is my house. The house your father and I dreamed of. The house where I raised you, and you." I paused, my heart breaking even as I said the words. "You are no longer welcome here. Both of you, get out." Thomas and Jessica stared at me in shock, clearly not expecting this response. As they gathered their things and left, I felt a mixture of pain and relief wash over me. The door closed behind them, and I sank onto the sofa, finally allowing the tears to come. The morning after I kicked Thomas and Jessica out, my phone started ringing incessantly. I let it go to voicemail, not ready to face the fallout. But as the days passed, the messages became more frequent and more aggressive. Finally, I answered one of Thomas's calls. His voice was cold and businesslike, a far cry from my loving son. "Mom, I've been doing some research," he said without preamble. "As Dad's son, I'm entitled to inherit from him. I want half the value of the house. If you don't cooperate, I'll take legal action." I hung up, my hands shaking. How had it come to this? The son I raised, threatening to sue me. Despite having the means to pay Thomas off, the thought of rewarding his behavior made me sick. The plans I'd drawn up for their new house now felt like a mockery. I shoved them into a drawer, determined not to give them another thought. Feeling lost, I reached out to Jack, an old friend of Tom's who had become a lawyer. We met at a local cafe, and I poured out the whole sordid story. "Abigail, I'm so sorry you're going through this," Jack said, "but I can assure you, legally you're in the clear. Tom's will left everything to you, no conditions." I felt a wave of relief, quickly followed by a surge of guilt. Should I be glad that my late husband had, inadvertently, protected me from our own son? Jack must have sensed my conflicted emotions. "Look, if Thomas does decide to sue, there will be some costs involved. You'll have to go through court proceedings, which can be stressful. But based on what you've told me, he doesn't have a leg to stand on." I clung to the hope that Thomas might come to his senses yet, even as his calls became less frequent. Maybe he was realizing the error of his ways. Maybe things would get better. Then came the morning that shattered that illusion. I woke up early, as usual, and went to get the newspaper. As I opened the front door, something caught my eye. There, stuck in my perfectly manicured lawn, was a giant for sale sign. As I stood there in shock, Mrs. Henderson from next door came over, concern etched on her face. "Abigail, dear, are you moving?" I had no idea. "We'll miss you terribly in the neighborhood." I opened my mouth, then closed it again, at a loss for words. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? More neighbors gathered, all full of questions I couldn't answer. Who was the realtor? When was the open house? Had I found a new place yet? Feeling overwhelmed, I retreated into the house and tried calling Thomas. It went straight to voicemail. I left message after message, each more desperate than the last. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I marched outside, grabbed the for sale sign, and yanked it out of the ground with all my strength. I carried it around to the back of the house and threw it behind the garden shed, out of sight. That evening I was trying to relax on the sofa, my mind still reeling from the events of the day. The house felt oppressively quiet. Suddenly the front door burst open, shattering the silence. Thomas strode in, Jessica close behind. But they weren't alone. A well-dressed couple followed them, looking around with obvious interest. "And this is the living room," Thomas was saying, his voice unnaturally bright. "Notice the vaulted ceilings and the custom fireplace." The couple nodded appreciatively. "It's stunning," the woman said. "We'd be prepared to make an offer right away." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "This house is not for sale. I'm going to have to ask you all to leave immediately." Thomas turned to the couple, an apologetic smile on his face. "I'm so sorry about this. This is just crazy old lady who sometimes wanders in. Pay her no attention." I felt like I'd been slapped. "Thomas, how dare you? I'm your mother." "See what I mean?" Thomas said smoothly. "Delusional. We'll have her removed, don't worry." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate my phone. "I'm calling the police right now if you don't all leave." Seeing I was serious, the couple hurried out. Thomas and Jessica lingered, fury evident on their faces. "You'll regret this," Jessica hissed. "You'll never see your son again. Or your grandchildren." As they stormed out, I suddenly noticed Jessica's slightly rounded stomach. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. She was pregnant. I was going to be a grandmother, and I might never even meet my grandchild. The following weeks were a blur of legal proceedings. Thomas and Jessica, backed by her parents' money, had hired a team of high-powered lawyers. They threw everything they had at me, trying to claim that Thomas had rights to the house, that I was mentally unfit, that I had promised to sign over the property. I was exhausted. My health began to suffer. Dark circles appeared under my eyes and I lost weight rapidly. Eventually, I had to quit my job. I simply couldn't concentrate on work with all this going on. One morning, as I was picking up the newspaper, checking, as always, to make sure no new for sale signs had appeared overnight, my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, approached me. "Abigail, dear," she said gently, "I hate to see you suffering like this. Have you considered going public with your story? There's a TV show that deals with family disputes. Maybe if you told your side?" I thanked her, but put the idea out of my mind, or at least I tried to. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was Thomas, his voice dripping with disdain. "Listen, you old fool," he snarled. "You can't hold out forever. Why don't you just give up and save us all a lot of trouble?" Something in me snapped. The pain, the betrayal, the sheer injustice of it all, it was too much. The next day I called the number Mrs. Henderson had given me. A week later I found myself sitting under bright lights, cameras pointed at me, telling my story to a sympathetic host and a shocked studio audience. As I spoke about the house Tom and I had built, about raising Thomas, about the betrayal and the legal battles, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. For the first time in months, I felt like someone was truly listening to me. I had no idea what the consequences of this decision would be, but as the audience murmured in sympathy and the host promised to get to the bottom of this, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the turning point I'd been praying for. A few days after my television appearance, I heard a knock at the door. I found myself face to face with Jessica's parents, looking uncomfortable and out of place on my porch. "May we come in?" Jessica's father asked, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. I nodded, bracing myself for another confrontation. But as we settled in the living room, they surprised me. "We saw you on TV," Jessica's mother began, her eyes brimming with tears. "We had no idea what Jessica and Thomas were doing. We're so sorry, Abigail." They explained how they'd spoiled Jessica, always giving in to her demands for money. When they learned about her pregnancy, they bought the couple an apartment, thinking it would make them happy. But Jessica was furious, her father said, shaking his head. "She said she deserved a house, not some cramped apartment when we refused. She said she'd handle it herself. We had no idea this is what she meant." "I was going to build them a house," I admitted, pulling out my old sketches. "I had the money, the plans. But after everything that's happened, I can't reward their behavior." Jessica's parents nodded in understanding. "We've decided to cut them off financially," her father said firmly. "No more money for lawyers or anything else. It's time they learned to stand on their own 2 feet." True to their word, Jessica's parents withdrew their financial support. Without the money for high-powered lawyers, Thomas and Jessica's case crumbled. The judge ruled in my favor, affirming my sole ownership of the house. I should have felt victorious, but mostly I just felt tired and sad. Months passed. I heard through the grapevine that Jessica had given birth to a boy, my grandson. The news brought a bittersweet ache to my heart. More time went by. Occasionally I'd get desperate calls from Thomas or Jessica, begging for money. Each time I forced myself to say no, even though it broke my heart a little more. Then, 2 years after that fateful TV appearance, I opened my door to find Thomas standing there. He looked terrible, thin, unkempt, with dark circles under his eyes. "Mom," he croaked, and then he broke down crying. Through his tears, Thomas poured out his heart. How he'd been selfish and stupid. How he'd let Jessica's greed infect him. How he now understood the sacrifices I'd made raising him alone. Part of me wanted to wrap him in my arms like I did when he was little, to tell him everything would be okay. But the wounds were still too fresh. "I'm not ready to forgive you, Thomas," I said gently. "You hurt me deeply. But I'd like to meet my grandson." We worked out an arrangement. Every other Saturday, Thomas would bring little Tom Jr. to visit. I'd babysit, buy him clothes and toys, and for a few hours I could pretend we were a normal, happy family. Surprisingly, it was Jessica who began to thaw first. One day, as she picked up Tom Jr., she paused. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you do for him. I understand now how lucky Thomas was to have you as a mother. As for Thomas and me, we're still working on rebuilding our relationship. Some days are better than others. Sometimes when he smiles, I see glimpses of my little boy, and other times, the memory of his betrayal is too strong to bear. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive him. The trust we once had may be gone forever. But as I watch Tom Jr. playing in the garden that his grandfather and I once dreamed of, I feel a sense of peace.